The Torah portion is Mishpatim, and Mishpatim has within it 53 of the 613 mitzvot. And it's a very daunting Torah portion, and I'll tell you why it's daunting. Because you come off the high of the Ten Commandments, the famous principles, which until very recent times, it was typical. You walked into any courthouse in the United States and there was a visualization of the Ten Commandments on the wall. And it was renowned as being the ultimate guidelines for living that the world knew. And then you get into the thicket of 53 Mishpatim, which we're going to classify here primarily as laws that would relate to justice, to the world being a just place. And it's such a thicket of laws. And really, we have the problem in last week's Torah reading also, because right after we finished the Ten Commandments, for example, one of the laws given is that when you build an altar to make an offering to God, you can't cut the stones you can't use metal or a sword to cut the stones. The stones have to be cut not using metal. And the whole process, how they did that, it was true for the Beit HaMikdash itself. And also such a mundane law. So Rabbi Hirsch makes an important linkage here. He says we have the principles of Judaism, of the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. And we've discussed in the past how by tradition, all 613 of the mitzvot are in fact tied to the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are deemed to be the principles, the ultimate principles of all 613 commandments. But what Hirsch says is the first thing after the Ten Commandments is to understand that violence itself speaks to a lack of justice. So hence coming down from Mount Sinai, so to speak, and wanting to transition to these laws of justice that the Torah is going to set forth for us here, these 53 mitzvot and all their details, some of their details that are here. The Torah wants to assert the idea that a world built on violence is the antithesis of justice. Okay. Now, just let's remember also that when you go back to Bereshit in Genesis in chapter 18, sentence 19, where God speaks and says, I love Avraham. Why? Because I know that he's going to teach his children, V'shamru derech Hashem, that they will guard the ways of God, my ways, Lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. That the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, will be marked by a sense of tzedakah, benevolence, and mishpat, and justice. Now, we live in a world and in a time where we see justice and benevolence as two completely separate things. And that's why that sentence that I just read to you is in relationship to the people of Sodom. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah, they held that kindness was illegal in their society. Why? Because each person's responsible for themselves. And you could even say, and there really is such a discussion in the Midrashim, where one of the Roman rulers challenged Rebbe Yehuda and said, how do you give charity? Obviously, God wants these people to be poor. What are you messing with God's system in the world? Now, that's the viewpoint of a person who sees the world as a place of strict justice. And of course, justice itself, which we like to feel is blind, but justice can become totally ruthless, as it was in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So therefore, when God speaks about Abraham, he first talks about tzedakah, being benevolent, and then mishpat, and of course, having an orderliness to the world where people know these are where my rights begin and this is where your rights begin. And therefore, we have a line of demarcation between the two. So there shouldn't be confusion and we don't end up contending with one another and fighting with one another. Whose apple is this? It fell from the tree. The tree was on my property, your property. Where's the property line? All the issues that are laid out in Mishpat. So that's the framework here. But the real accusation about Judaism, and that's what I want to deal with tonight, is the following. Judaism becomes, in the eyes of some people, as a religion made up of minutia, of laws, 613 rules for living. And where's the love? Where's the greatness? Where's the spirituality of it? And what we're going to try to look for is we're going to try to look for that aspect of the laws themselves. And to do so originally, I want to turn to the issue of the orphan and the widow, which is dealt with 36 times in the Torah. But it happens to be, if you turn to page 430 in the Stone Chumash, and the Torah does discuss orphans and widows, and by so they're speaking about the vulnerable of society, 36 times. But we're going to look at two of them, and they both fall in this week's Torah reading, and they both fall just a few sentences away from each other. On page 430, sentence 20, chapter 22, sentence 20, we encounter the following. Beger lo toneh v'lo tilchatzeno. You shall not taunt or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Okay, so there's a particular mitzvah, and there happens to be another mitzvah in the Torah, which talks about the idea of not oppressing any other human being, and which is a tenet of Judaism, because people are meant to deal with each other on a fair plane, on a flat plateau, where I'm a human being, you're a human being, we respect each other, and it's not a question of us checking and positioning ourselves to see who has the better of the other. If you turn to chapter 23, sentence 9, which is on page 434, you find seemingly the same mitzvah, but with a slightly different emphasis. The ger lo tilchot, v'atem yidatem es nefesh hager, ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. So here the Torah adds something very significantly. The Torah adds the idea that it's not just that you were oppressed, but rather the matter at hand is that you experienced, you know the soul of a stranger, you know the feelings of a stranger. And there are various ways of sorting out the two layers that the Torah is laying down here. It's interesting that the Ramban Nachmanides gives a global idea. He says, remember, you were enslaved in Egypt. You were strangers in Egypt. You were aliens. You were alienated. You were oppressed. And according to the Ramban, in an interesting way, and what was your experience? God rescued you. So understand something about the world, the Ramban says, and this weaves its way through the entire Torah, according to him. God is a player. God is active in the world. Who knows that better than we, the Jewish people? Because we weren't simply enslaved. We weren't simply oppressed. We didn't simply suffer, but we experienced firsthand
sit with you for a minute.
how God can intervene in the world, and God can rescue a person. And for a person to mistreat the orphan or the widow, you're acting as though God is not a player in the world, and you're denying that. So what you're doing, in classical thought terms, is you're building a wall between my religious life, my connection to God, and my temporal life, which is something that the world often does. And when it comes to business, and when it comes to property rights, if I have an opportunity to take advantage of someone, even a vulnerable person, I'm going to do so because that's the way of the world. And that's what we're going to talk about here. What is the way of the world? How is the world meant to function? Yes.
I'm going to take advantage of your invitation to ask
Please.
questions.
Please do.
This
And anybody else
commandment,
that wants to unmute yourself and please ask. Yes.
this commandment, do not oppress a stranger. I don't understand what that has to do with the fact that we were strangers in the land of Egypt. Even if we were not strangers in the land of Egypt, there should be a commandment, do not oppress a stranger.
Right.
What does one have to do with the other?
So, a good question. So that's why the Ramban Nachmanides takes this approach, that understand that by looking at the world in a physical sense, and by saying, oh, this guy is someone I can take advantage of. This guy doesn't know the local real estate market. I could sell him this bridge, even though it doesn't belong to me, because he's a stranger here. When I do that, Nachmanides asserts, we are not recognizing our own experience, which was that when we were oppressed with overwhelming force, when we were in Egypt and our situation was hopeless, and when anybody would have looked around the world and wanted to bet on the future of the Jewish people as compared to the future of the Egyptian people, everybody would have bet on the Egyptians. Why? Because they didn't realize that God is an active player in the world. So the Torah here is telling us, of course, you shouldn't put anyone down. Of course, all people have feelings. Of course, we are expected to recognize the divine image in each and every human being. That goes without saying. But when we act in the world in a manner which says that we have certain advantages here, and we, so to speak, only God will know how I'm deceiving this other person or taking advantage of them, then we're denying our experience in Egypt, where miraculously God rescued us. God has every opportunity to miraculously rescue the widow or the orphan whom we are also mistreating. So what the Torah here is introducing is that draw upon the Jewish experience in a very meaningful way, not simply on the level that, oh, I know what it's like to suffer, so therefore I'm going to be extra careful that other people don't suffer, which itself is a nice level for a person to be at. But go beyond that. Understand, Nachmanides asserts, God is always on the side of the underdog, on the oppressed person, and God will always intervene on their behalf. And there are many other sentences in the Torah, including some in this week's Torah reading, which talk about an orphan crying out to God, and God will certainly have compassion upon him. That's the attitude that the Torah is commending to us here. But I want to go a little further. What I want to say is the reason that there's these two sentences are here with their disparate clauses, one saying, you experienced bitterness of oppression, therefore be sensitive to the widow and the orphan, to the stranger. The next sentence says, you know the nefesh hager, you know the soul, you know the experience of being an alien. And I think the reason that the two are laid in here is the following reason. Because these are not laws that we look up in the book and we say, okay, I guess I'm permitted to say this and I'm not permitted to say this. I'm looking for a way around this or a way around that. These are laws that are meant to be built on as we develop ourselves as human beings. So the way I would put it is the following to make it clearer. The Torah lays down a marker. Oppressing any other person is wrong, and certainly oppressing the vulnerable is wrong. Next, but not only simple oppression or taking advantage of them in business, because this is where the Talmud plays it out, the manner in which you speak to them, the references you make to them, some things that are very innocuous. Talmud gives an example of, and I'll lay the example out there, a person whose father was hung for a crime, and we're walking through the marketplace, and I say, oh, look at those fish hanging on the hook over there. So the Torah says, for me to just speak that way without having that sensitivity that I might be evoking in the person I'm with, a particular sensitivity that that person has based on his own experience, means for me to deny the shared experience of the Jewish people. We know suffering, we know vulnerability, and therefore we have to become increasingly sensitive throughout our lives to the vulnerability of others. So that if we start out as young people and we learn, I'm not going to cheat you in business, and then I learn when, maybe I'll even look out for you and talk you up and help you get a promotion because there's nobody else on your behalf. And then there's stages even of sublime sensitivity in speaking where I treat you differently than I treat anyone else in the world because I'm tuned in to your sensitivities, just as I remember people who were once upon a time so unaware of the sensitivities I was going through, that the Jewish people were going through when we were so oppressed. So it's a lifetime of growth. It's a lifetime of development. It's a lifetime of changing the way the world operates. And as we grow, as these mishpatim, which are not simply, like I say, markers on the table that we can navigate around and over and under and through, which is the general attitude towards law, they're not meant that way. They're meant to be springboards for growth and development and sensitivity as we tune into them. And I want to illustrate this in a dramatic way. And this is an idea that Rabbi Foreman put forward in a recent podcast, but he does something very interesting here. Let's look at the beginning of this Parsha Mishpatim. And much creates much difficulty for us, because the initial three situations it deals with are situations which are hard to imagine. A person steals and he's sold into bondage. A person is guilty of theft, he's poor, he has a debt to repay, he has no means of repaying that, so he becomes an indentured servant to a fellow Jew. So a fellow Jew pays off his loan, and he has to work for up to 6 years. On his 7th year, he's going to go free. If he marries within that servitude, then his wife and children remain when he goes free, which of course could prompt him to decide, I never want to go free, and I'll remain an indentured servant my entire life, which is something the Torah frowns on, because the order of the world, again, the spiritual order of the world is meant to be that all human beings take on responsibility for themselves. We help one another, we guide one another, we give tzedakah, but we operate as independent people. We don't make ourselves servant. As the Talmud says, be a servant to God, don't be a servant to one of God's servants. Maintain your dignity as a person. But this person can't do that. He remains forever, but of course, forever doesn't mean forever. It means until the 50th Jubilee year, whereupon everything restarts and everyone is restored to their full measure of human dignity, ancestral lands, and everything else.
So, Rabbi, just a clarification here.
Sure.
I think I heard you say that if he marries during his period of servitude,
If his owner gives him a wife, I'm sorry, he can marry, but if his owner provides him with a wife.
right, and that would be a non-Jewish wife. That's what I wanted to
It
clarify.
would be right. When you say non-Jewish, once anyone is a servant in a Jewish household, they have a certain status where they keep all the negative, they're responsible to keep all the negative commandments of the Torah. So they could almost be conceived of as, we don't use these terms, but like partially Jewish. Okay? So it's not as simple as a dichotomy, but you're right. But in any event, now, should he marry under these conditions, he has to understand that he's living under the protection of his master. His master provides him with a wife. There's children. That wife and those children will remain in servants to his person he's in servitude to, even when he chooses to leave, which he should choose to leave. And then you get the case of a daughter, and again, you're dealing with an extreme here, but the way it's mostly understood, and that this gives an opportunity for very poor people to entrust their daughters into the care of people who have means as servant, but very protected as a servant. And here the Torah lays on one layer of protection after another, the goal being that either a child of the person, the girl in household, will marry her and treat her like a wife with all the rights of any other wife, with nothing diminished, or she will return back to the house of her father. So in a way, it's a social experiment to try to provide a manner for extremely poor families to re-enter society with greater dignity and greater respect. Now, here's what Rabbi Foreman does in an amazingly creative way. And it merits our attention, although I see it a little differently than he does. If you go back to Genesis, the whole story of Jacob running to the house of Lavan and getting married there and leaving 20 years later with his wives and with his children have echoes of all three of these stages. And what's so intriguing, there's language connections. Rabbi Foreman weaves it together very beautifully. I mentioned a few of them. What's so intriguing, if we go down this journey, this thought journey for a few minutes, it gives you a whole new perspective on the story of Jacob running to the house of Lavan and Jacob marrying Lavan's daughters. He only intended to marry one, but he ends up married to 2 or 4 of them, depending on what version you look at, and living there as a servant for 20 years, and then leaving with wealth of his own, which was by an agreement he wrestled out of Lavan. And it's so interesting to see this, because if you look at, if we want to look at chapter 29 in Genesis, sentence 10, but I think I'm not going to go through the sentences so clearly because it'll take much too long. But let's look at this one. Chapter 29, sentence 10. And this is, as is described, a very romantic sentence. It's on page 149 in the article. I'll read it in English. And it was when Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of Lavan, his mother's brother, and the flock of Lavan, his mother's brother. Jacob came forward and rolled the stone off the mouth of the well and watered the sheep of Lavan, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and raised his voice and wept. Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. Then she ran and told her father. This sentence, when you take this section of the Torah and you hold it up in light of these first 3 sections of Mishpatim, they read completely differently than you would think otherwise. Because now what we're seeing for the first time, I'm seeing, is here's Jacob as a stranger, as an alien, as a person who had to run from the house of his mother and father at threat that his brother was going to kill him. He comes to a strange place. He's at the well. And then he becomes fixated. This is my mother's brother's daughter. This is my mother's brother's flock. Here I'm alone in the world. I'm penniless. I have nothing going for me. I'm under threat. And here's an opportunity for me to find family and to be joined to family. So it colors, the lens is shifted, and it colors the whole narrative now of one of let's be sympathetic to the plot, to the plight of Jacob, our forefather. Because what happens to him? He goes to his father, he goes to Rachel's father. Rachel's father hugs him, kisses him, brings him in. Oh, you'll stay with us. It's great. It's great. I'll work for 7 years. Now look at the parallel here. For the privilege of marrying your daughter, your younger daughter, Rachel. He becomes deceived. He has to work another 7 years, 14 years in total, beyond which the Torah says is not justice no matter what. And then he has to work another 6 years while his children are being born in order to be able to leave and go back to his parents' house with a few shekels to his name. Because until then, he's been totally taken advantage as a servant, working day and night. And then, of course, what happens? He leaves surreptitiously, and Lavan chases him down. And Lavan says very famously, and listen to these words, these are my daughters, these are my children. You're absconding with everything that is mine. And we know from the Pesach Haggadah, from the Passover Haggadah, that in these words, Lavan really meant to uproot the entire future of the Jewish people. He was asserting something that I've tricked you, I fooled you, you're my servant, you're my slave. And even if you want to be emancipated, your wives and children remain with me, the master. and I'm in control. And and Lavan would have pursued that had not God intervened and come to him at night and put the fear of God into him and told him to leave these people alone. And then in the end, they make an agreement the next day where Lavan and his son-in-law Jacob have a truce, so to speak. And in the course of that, listen to the words that Lavan says, Yishbot Elokei Avicha Avraham Elokei Avi Nochar Beinenu. God will rule. In other words, Lavan is still not willing to let go of his own twisted sense of what justice is. To him, I tricked you. You're my slave. Everything you have belongs to me. You're entitled to nothing. And only through God's direct interference, the Jewish people able to return back to the land of Canaan, rejoin Yitzchak, and go about our business. So what you get here is an amazing mirror of look at the world in its primitive, natural state, where someone like Lavan, who was ruthless, but ruthless in the sense of being able to trick people, to trap people, to get his way with all of his justifications along the way. Well, we don't give the younger daughter before the older daughter. You get the spotted ones, I get the striped ones. No, you get the striped ones, I get the spotted ones. Everything is a moral dilemma that only he knows the truth of. So much like the world is on so many levels today. So many simple ideas are unclear today. So the Torah in Bereshit sets out the world the way the world typically is. And then we come to Mishpatim. We come to the Jewish people coming down from Mount Sinai, camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, having been inspired by God's direct communication, inspired by the idea that forever we won't use metal utensils to fashion our offerings to God because we want to distance ourselves from violence. We want to make the world a place where it's not power, it's not dog eat dog. It's going to be an orderly place. It's going to be a place of consideration. It's going to be a place of sensitivity. It's going to be a place where rather than seeking revenge if I've been wronged in the past, I'm going to be the kind of person who says, wow, I know what it's like to be wronged. So when I sit down and deal with this person, I'm going to bend over backwards to see to it that right is right and that everyone is protected and that I'm not unduly taking advantage of anyone else. And that becomes a trajectory of what Mishpat is all about. And that's why in the prophets it says the world will be redeemed through justice. God forbid that the prophet doesn't mean we're going to take our swords and we're going to maraud through the world and we're going to chop off the heads of all the disbelievers. That's not at all what the prophets were talking about. They're talking about a world in which people strive to supersede their own limited, self-centered view of things and really seek to find a viewpoint which is fair, which is just, which takes into account everyone's situation appropriately, balances them out. And that's why there's always a scale of justice and deals with them fairly. And I want to conclude this class with a medrash that it's actually a medrash in the book of Bereshit. It's in Medrash Rabbah. I looked it up. It's for those people who want to look it up at home. It is in Medrash Rabbah 33:1 in Genesis. But the Medrash tells a story that Alexander the Great he was conquering the world. He came to this kingdom called Cassia. And he sat down with the king. And he asked the king, tell me about justice here. Tell me your system of justice. So the king said, fine, let's judge a case together. I spend time judging cases. So right away, two men came before the court. And what happened is Mr. A had bought a field, an empty field, from Mr. B. When Mr. A started to plow the field and cultivate the field, he found buried treasure there. So he comes to court and says, I have this buried treasure that was in the field. I want to give it back to Mr. B because I really only intended to buy a field. I only paid for him to buy 5 acres that I could grow tomatoes on, and I know how much that's worth, and that was my intention, and I paid him that fair price for the land. But now it turns out there was a treasure there. I want to give the treasure back to him. Whereupon the seller of the land argues the other one and says, no, look, I sold him the land fair and square. He came to me, he wanted the land. I had no idea there was treasure there. I sold it to him at a price I was happy with. He discovered the treasure. He should keep it. And this was the back and forth in the court of law. Very sublime moment. So the king, in judging the case, asked each of these people, tell me about your families. And one said, well, I have an eligible daughter. And the other said, oh, I have an eligible son. The king said, great, here's the ruling of the court. Let your son marry his daughter. Let them inherit the treasure that was found in the land. And then we'll know that there's pure justice, peace, harmony in the world. Everything is as it should be. So the king makes that ruling. Whereupon he looks at Alexander, and Alexander is red-faced, astonished, bewildered, angered by what he sees in the court of law. So he says, so the king says to Alexander, because Alexander's the powerful one with the army and the phalanx and everything, says, oh, how would you have ruled? He says, how would I have ruled? I would have put both men to death, and I would have taken the treasure for the government, for the king, for myself. How else would anybody rule? So what do you see here? This medrash evokes something, which is that as a society embraces mishpat, and as a society becomes ever more sensitized to the perspective of someone else, and ever more caring about the well-being of others alongside with yourself. You don't have to give away everything you own. You're living a normal life, but you're careful what you say to people, especially vulnerable people. You're careful when you do business dealings. You know, oh, you're selling me this bridge. You know, to me, it's worth $500 million. I see great potential in it. You're happy to sell it for that. I expect to make money off of this. Okay, but we understand that's the way business works. You're going to develop the asset further. Fine, I'll sell it to you for $500 million. And 10 years later, it could be worth double that thanks to your investment and your vision. Good, that's fair enough. We're not talking about a world that doesn't have such business to it. But you see, Alexander the Great could not tolerate a world where there wasn't a sense that there are people in power and there are people who are not in power. There are people who need to take charge and there are people who need to bow to their authority. Mishpat, by definition, when God said originally to Abraham that you're going to teach your children la'asos tzedakah mishpat, it doesn't mean that we're going to be a people that walks around with a law book and we look everything up. We say, oh, I'm allowed to do this. I'm not allowed to do this. I can cut this corner. I'm going to get a certain rabbi to give me a dispensation here. No. God was talking about a person like Abraham who was curious about the world, who wanted to understand God's sense of justice and right and wrong to the nth degree so that he could aspire to grow toward it. And so that his inclinations and nature would develop in such a way that he would become more godlike. And he knows in order to do that, it requires for a person not simply to follow the letter of the law, not simply to check boxes, but it requires a person to embrace the whole concept of the law. So if the Torah tells me in one line that I can't oppress the stranger because we were once strangers, so there's a multiple sense of levels there. Number one, as Hillel summed up the entire Torah, That which is hateful to you, don't do to your fellow. This becomes the essence, according to Hillel, of what the Torah's teaching is all about. You had a bad experience. You tasted bitterness. So forever build on that to become ever more sensitive to the needs of other people so that you can help them more, so that you can acknowledge them more, so that you can help them build lives for themselves. This is the sense of what Eila HaMishpatim Asher Tosim Lifnehem. And as Rashi says, these laws, we have lawyers, and we have lawyers today in all systems who know the law inside out. And we have people we can consult with. But Asher Tosim Lifnehem, these are laws that should be on the table in front of us, because these laws can give us inspiration and guidance and help us develop as human beings and become more fully representative of being beings created in the image of God. And let's not forget what the Nachmanides, what the Ramban says also, and become ever more tuned in to the notion that God is an active player in what takes place in the world. And although it doesn't always seem that way to us, it seems as though God's hiding his face, looking away, busy with somebody else, vacated the premises, and we go through sometimes long periods of time and it's very disheartening. We experienced God's loving redemption out of Egypt, and understand that the same God who cast down the Egyptian society so that we could go free is out there protecting the vulnerable of society today. And our job is to join God in that effort and not try to take advantage of the system as if God was not a player. So these are laws that are anything but minutia. These are laws that you can see put the wind in the sails of the Ten Commandments and make them real and actualize them in everyday life. Happy to answer any questions.